Let's go ahead and get started then. This is our fourth class in the Door to Satisfaction, working with Rinpoche's teachings in the book by that same name. And let's go ahead and do our prayers to get things started today. So we'll get those on screen and recite those together. So again, we're making all these prayers of homage to begin with, and then recalling some of the basic teachings of the Buddha. So let's recite these together. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage. To all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I'm going to do the short mandala offering to create some positive potential, some merit by making this vast pure offering to all the holy beings, to the Buddhas, our gurus, and so on, with the intention that we can receive their blessings and inspiration and actualize all the teachings of the Dharma in our own minds as quickly as possible. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. And then finally, refuge and bodhicitta before the teaching. Bringing these 2 thoughts to mind, we'll recite this first in English and then 2 times in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki chanyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, good. Thank you, Mary. Let's go ahead and begin then with a short meditation as usual. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, and then we'll set our motivation and bodhicitta together. So again, use the breath as a meditation object if you wish. If you have another object you prefer, you can use that. But for most of us, it's quite easy just to tune into the breath, whatever way suits your mind, trying to stay present with the breath through the inhalation, through the exhalation, and whenever you see that the mind's wandered, gently guide the mind back to the breath, letting go of whatever it was that distracted you. So I will ring the bell to begin a short meditation period. Again, I'll come in a few minutes to lead you in a guided meditation to set your motivation. So now let's set our motivation together. And to do this today, I'd like to share a little sort of visualization exercise using our imagination a little bit. This is a meditation I used many, many years ago, and I haven't really resurrected it, but I'll use it today. So imagine that you've been wandering through a network of caves that are pitch black. This has been happening for so long that you can't even remember seeing the light. You enter into one cave and you stumble on a box, and you open the box and you feel inside there, and there's a candle, and there's also a match. And so you light the candle and it illuminates the cave that you're in. And you see that in the box, there are additional instructions about how to find another candle, how to eventually proceed from lit room to lit room, all the way out of this maze of dark caves. It's all right there, written on a piece of paper that you can now see so clearly with the candle that you have lit. But then you look up and you see that this cave that you're in is filled with jewels, all sorts of amazing, beautiful jewels that are embedded in the cave walls and in the ceiling. They're stunning, they're enticing. And for a moment, you simply get totally enthralled with the appearance of these beautiful jewels that are in this cave. So you're stuck now with a decision. Do you continue to look at the beautiful jewels as the candle continues to diminish moment by moment, moving towards its inevitable end, the end of the light that you have come upon? Or do you leave behind all these enticing jewels and move to the next cave using the directions that you've been given, so you can at least get another candle, another chance to continue on the map to eventually be free of the caves once and for all, and perhaps to be able to, even through the freedom you've attained, help others to be free from that same darkness? So which one will you do? So as we've been discussing in this course, most of us have gotten quite enthralled by the appearance of the jewels. We see all the pleasures of this life and become very attached to them. We cling to them. We don't want to be separated from them. But the reality is like the jewels that are embedded in the cave walls, we can't take a single one of them with us. All these pleasures, just transitory, passing, fleeting. And the Buddha says that while we have the light of this human life, we need to use it very wisely. We need to make sure that we at least let go of our attachment to the pleasures of this life, to move forward with some determination to at least gain a good rebirth after this life, as well as the greater motivations of becoming free once and for all from samsara, from the darkness that we've been in since beginningless time. And moreover, achieve enlightenment, the state where we can become the light for others, help them to find that candle that will help them on their path, guide them through the maze of samsara, all the way to their own liberation and enlightenment. So again, the choice is ours. And so let's choose today to generate those motivations that are about moving beyond this life, achieving the happiness of good rebirths, but moreover, the happiness of liberation and the greatest bliss and happiness of enlightenment. And we do this so that we can benefit all sentient beings, because we see how they too are wandering in the darkness of samsara, without a guide, without a light. Okay, good. Again, welcome today to our fourth class on door to satisfaction. So we've been working in the last few classes in particular with these 8 worldly concerns or worldly dharmas. And again, Rinpoche defined these dharmas as not being the dharma that we are ideally supposed to practice. We're going to look at that a little bit more today. But we see once more that the problem with these kind of 4 sets, these pairs, we get attracted to having material gain, having things in our lives, and we are also attracted to the idea of not losing those, not having any loss or diminishment in our resources. We get quite attracted to comfort and wanting things to be pleasurable, enjoyable. And of course, this is what we're all involved in with the 5 sense objects, right? Is always wanting delightful sounds and, delicious tastes and beautiful, things around us, as well as being able to, have the comforts of a cushy life. And of course, we have a strong aversion to the opposite. We're quite attached to not receiving discomfort, displeasure. And then, of course, we go on to the other ones that are more about our how we are perceived. Reputation needs to be good, and that's that bigger overall picture of how people see us in the world. And then we're quite attached to avoiding a bad reputation. And then the last pair, the more direct things that we receive from others, which are praise and criticism, where we really want the praise and we want to hear those delightful sounds of people saying good things about us, and we're quite averse to the opposite, having anyone point out our faults, say anything critical of us in the least. So we did a little bit meditation last Tuesday. Some of you were there for that in the morning meditation. It's out on YouTube if you'd like to do that. Came from Rinpoche's book, How to Practice Dharma, which is all about the 8 worldly concerns. And he essentially encourages us with that last pair of praise and criticism to really just see that these are just sounds. These are just words that are being uttered by others. It's our own minds that make them into praise, criticism, what have you. This is the whole gist of this part of the course, really, is to truly understand that happiness and suffering reside within our own minds, and that our tendency to go after those 4 pleasurable objects and avoid the 4 unpleasurable objects isn't really the way to achieve true happiness. Happiness and peace comes from within rather than depending upon getting those 4 objects and avoiding the other 4 objects. So I'm going to go back into a little bit of a slideshow again for today and share a little bit more of what Rinpoche, whoops, what did I click on there? I thought I clicked on that, but I somehow didn't. Okay. There we go. Okay. So let's continue on again. We're going to move into this topic today that I like to call cutting off desire, because it's the title of Rinpoche's chapter on that. We've kind of, again, discussed the 8 worldly dharmas. They're going to keep coming up in reference simply because they are the most manifest way that we can see how we are involved in desire, how we are motivated by desire. And so Rinpoche is going to give us some advice in this chapter, and I'll share some of his teachings. We'll discuss them a bit about how we cut off desire, at least some of the initial stages. Recall that again in the Lam Rim, this topic of the 8 worldly dharmas is taught right at the very beginning. And that's because we have to understand that if we are, although we acknowledge we have this precious human rebirth, if we get totally enthralled in, like I was doing in the meditation, the jewels in the cave, we just spend our time kind of looking up at all these beautiful things, trying to enjoy them all in the space of the light that we have in this life that, gives us some, respite from the darkness that we've been experiencing. This is the whole thing that the Buddha says, that most of us have been in the lower realms for countless eons, and now we're sort of popping out into the light of this human life. But what do we do with it? Are we getting totally enthralled with all these pleasurable things, or are we going to do something more useful? So the idea here is, again, that's the initial starting point for our entry into the path, is to recognize that while we have this human rebirth, we have to let go of our preoccupation with the happiness of this life. And of course, the attachment that comes with all of that. That brings us into the path. And of course, we continue to work against desire and attachment. The more lasting ways of working to counteract our desire aren't taught until we get to the middle scope of the 3 scopes of the Lam Rim. In the very first scope, all we're doing is trying to get a little bit more control over our behavior, a little bit more control over our various actions of body and speech primarily. And we begin to work on the mind in a little bit more detail in the middle scope. And that's where we learn all the techniques of counteracting desire, anger, pride, jealousy, and so on, as well as the root of ignorance. And then in the great scope, of course, we enlarge that to have a concern for others in terms of what they're experiencing and their faults, and trying to embrace them in terms of benefiting them through our actions and so on. And we are going to touch on some of that in this course even today, later today, talk a bit about bodhicitta motivation and how it really helps as a counterforce to so much of this desire for this life. But really the deeper antidotes to desire aren't really taught until much later. But nonetheless, we have to work against our desire pretty strongly right at the beginning of the path. Otherwise, we're going to end up just, again, being like that person that's enthralled with the beauty of this life, but doesn't do anything to create the causes for our next existence. So Rinpoche says, not following desire is practicing Dharma. Following desire is not practicing Dharma. It is as simple as that. I mean, it really does come down to it. We're going to see this in a couple of different ways in the slides that I'm sharing from this section. But this is the essence of what we mean, is that if we are actually practicing Dharma, then we're not following the mind of desire. We're not captured by that. We're not driven by that. We're not going to continue to waste this life by chasing after all these things that once more are incapable of satisfying. Instead, we're going to put our attention on those things that will produce at least the satisfaction beyond this life, which is a good rebirth, so we can continue this path, just like, again, in my analogy of the person moving from the one cave to the next. You want to at least use the light of this life to get to the next light, to get to another experience where you have your eyes open, where you can see what existence is all about. Not so that you can enjoy more beautiful jewel-embedded caves. That's not the point. The point is so that you can actually make progress and eventually be free from all of this. So the whole point, Rinpoche says, of the text that he was using as the basis for this book that he wrote, Opening the Door of Dharma, the whole point of these instructions from the holy mouths of the Kadampa Geshes, again, these amazing Geshes who are from the lineage of Dromtonpa, who was Lama Atisha's heart disciple, lived about 1,000 years ago. And this whole Kadampa lineage of people who practice this way and really embed these teachings into their lives arose. And we can still practice like these Kadampa Geshes because they left behind all these amazing instructions. Again, these instructions which they practiced and experienced, the whole point is to cut off the 8 worldly dharmas, to be free of desire clinging to this life. And of course, to go beyond that, even because they are Mahayana practices, Lojong is taught as a way of enhancing our bodhicitta to, again, even embrace the idea of using this life for the greatest purpose, to benefit all beings, so that we end up utilizing whatever we're experiencing as a door to connecting with others, deepening our compassion, our love, and so on. Again, we'll get into that more probably in next week's class. But whether you are practicing Dharma or not, the evil thought of the 8 worldly dharmas is the source of all obstacles and problems. Everything undesirable comes from this thought of the worldly dharmas. This is a contemplation. Whoops, let me take it off screen. This is a contemplation which I think we can all do. I mean, we've all got exposure now to these 8 worldly dharmas, and hopefully you've been spending some time looking at them and sort of identifying what are the main ones that are triggers for you. What are the things that are your go-to when you feel like you need that hit of happiness? Is it, going out and buying something, acquiring things? Is it, the comfort of taking care of yourselves in overindulgent ways? What is it that you find that is the thing that helps you to feel good about yourself and to feel like you're getting some happiness in this world? Again, it's true, you are getting some happiness, but we have to look at the nature of that happiness. That happiness is only going to be there temporarily, and it will cause, if we're following that happiness with attachment, with desire, it will cause problems invariably. And all of our problems are arising from that. When we hear about various things in the news, people who do things, people who, for example, a parent who takes the children away from the other parent because of the custody battle that they're going through or whatever, it's all driven by the 8 worldly concerns. It's all driven by this clinging to our own happiness, not being able to see anything beyond that, and causing pain and suffering for others in the process of that. All the various things going on in our world are driven by these 8 worldly concerns, whether it be at the individual level, at the societal level, at the nation level, the world level, what have you. So, this is what's gotten us into, to a large degree, the problem we're in terms of climate change, is following the mind of desire and always wanting to accumulate more and more things, better things, the iPhone 11 or 12 or whatever they're up to now. I've lost track, just to keep going after those things, thinking that they're going to satisfy, and they don't. And in the end, we just create more problems for ourselves. So Rinpoche says it is easy to understand how it can be a problem not to acquire things, to be unhappy, to hear uninteresting sounds, or to have a bad reputation, to be criticized. Again, that's that column of the things we want to avoid. And so I think it's really easy to see that those are a problem. These are commonly recognized as problems, and we always have sympathy for people when they say, "Oh, I lost my job," or "Oh, somebody's speaking badly about me," or "Oh, I'm not getting along with my relatives," or whatever. But we go, we have lots of concern for people because we see that those are not things that people want to go through. We quite easily identify those as problems. Then he says, but you might not recognize acquiring things, having comfort and happiness, hearing interesting sounds, having a good reputation, being praised as problems. However, they are all the same. They are all problems. Again, once more, he's going to go into this and define this a little bit more clearly in the slides to come. We're not talking about those individual things being the problem. The problem is the mind of desire in relation to those. But of course, we become quite preoccupied with them, right? As I was pointing out in that meditation, we could spend hours and hours, just in lifetimes and lifetimes engaging in all the beautiful things that we see around us, the beautiful jewels that entice us of this life. And we've all had these pleasures, the Buddha says, countless times before. Every single pleasure of samsara, we're no stranger to. We've known these things. And what have they done for us? They've only increased our desire because we go after them with a mind of desire. Again, experiencing them without desire is a whole new thing. I mean, this is something we have to learn how to do, and that's what Rinpoche is going to give us some advice on, because there can be a happiness that arises without the clinging. The pleasure of those experiences is not the problem. Our clinging to them is the problem. So let's go forward, and Rinpoche will go into some of this in a bit more detail in the teachings in that book. He says, but the object itself is not the problem. Having wealth is not the problem. Having lots of things in your life is not the problem. Having lots of comforts and what have you is not the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is the mind desiring and clinging to wealth. That is the problem. So we really have to see that there is an inability right now, perhaps, and that's because we are so caught up in the patterns, to always experience these pleasurable things with the mind of attachment, with the mind that craves for them, that is exaggerating their qualities, that doesn't want to be separated from them, that wants to re-experience them. We put so much attention again into all of that. That becomes the problem. We become prisoners of these objects, of these experiences. They actually take our happiness away. They don't give us more happiness. And that's, of course, what Rinpoche is trying to get across in this book, is that, if we are looking for true satisfaction, the door to satisfaction is the door of Dharma. And the very first step into the portal of the door of Dharma is letting go of our desire, letting go of our attachment for all these worldly pleasures. Again, I think it's, the message is kind of clear. It's just he's going to keep pounding it in through the things that I'm sharing with you, because I think we have to hear this so that we begin to move away from those patterns that are not part of the solution. They're actually part of the problem. So the mind that clings gets stuck to the object of desire. When you receive praise, oh, you are so intelligent, you speak so well. On Tuesday, I used the idea of somebody saying, you are so good. And then, of course, the criticism where they just change one letter when they say, you are no good. So what's the difference between those two? It's just a s sound and a n. sound, that makes so into no. But we get so caught up in it when we hear somebody say, you are so good, you are so intelligent, you speak so well, you're so beautiful, you have such, wonderful qualities, whatever they're saying to us. You understand Dharma so well. Your mind gets stuck to the praise and is no longer free. This is the problem, is we get stuck to that. We adhere to that. And of course, we're doing an equal adherence with regard to you are no good. You are so stupid. You are whatever, all the things that we might hear from somebody. And maybe that's not the larger part of the people, that are involved in our lives that are telling us that. But we stick to that one person then, and we can't get it out of our head. Why does so-and-so think that I'm so stupid? Why do they think I'm so ugly? Why do they think I'm, whatever, they put a whatever quality in there? We get totally stuck on that too. It's kind of interesting. I don't want to bring these teachings in too much of a way because they're not really from our tradition, but many of you, I'm sure, have read or listened to some of Venerable Pema Chodron's teachings on what she calls Shenpa. I think it's Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, one of her gurus, who introduced her to this idea of Shenpa. Shenpa, the word in Tibetan, has that translation sometimes of attachment or clinging. But the idea here is that she highlights it as the way we get stuck. We get hooked by these things. And this is happening with regard to most things in our day that are either pleasurable or unpleasurable. They hook us. It's like suddenly there's some adhesive that has connected to us. And if it's something pleasurable, again, we get quite hooked with this mind that is craving and desiring them and wanting them to continue to be in our lives, not being separated from them, not wanting anyone else to have them. And of course, if it's something that is unpleasurable, we're hooked still. But the flavor of the hooking is a little bit different, because here we're hooked in a negative way to where we have that strong aversion and are pushing it away. But if they're both hooked, it's whether your mind is going to get hooked or not. But I think we're talking about the same thing. Again, Rinpoche doesn't use the word Shenpa that Pema Chodron uses, but I think it's the same idea, is that when we have these experiences, they latch onto us. We get stuck in them. And then they become something that pulls us into a whole pattern that we don't want to go into ideally. If we look back, kind of peel it back to what is our basic motivation, as we did when we started this whole course. The basic motivation of all beings is to obtain happiness and to be rid of suffering. This is what's motivating even the smallest little protozoa, in terms of how it's going about living its life. It moves towards what is attractive and kind of beneficial for it. It moves away from what is detrimental to it. Whether you're at that level or whether you're as a human being, perhaps one of the most complex organisms on this planet, you are still driven by that same fundamental desire. And the Buddha didn't criticize that desire. He didn't say, you guys need to get rid of that desire to be happy and to not suffer. He just said, you're going about it the wrong way. Again, if you want to fulfill your happiness, you don't create patterns that cause more suffering. It sounds very simple when we hear it that way, but we've been doing this since beginningless time. We keep chasing after those things, getting enticed with them, craving them, desiring them, and of course, having the same thing with regard to not getting the unpleasant, unfavorable situations. And so we have this kind of fundamental guiding ourselves into patterns that are not helpful, patterns that only create more suffering. And we're going to talk a little bit later today about how do they create more suffering. Of course, it's because they end up causing non-virtue. They are non-virtuous states of mind. There was a question raised a little bit, I think it was last week or the week before, about how do we determine what is virtue and non-virtue. We'll get into that a little bit today, because essentially anything that is driven by these non-virtuous states of mind is going to have the flavor of non-virtue. And of course, according to the law of karma, is going to simply create more suffering. So we go after these pleasurable things with a mind of craving. We experience the pleasure at the moment. And there's no denying that. I mean, that's a feeling that you're experiencing from those objects that you crave. But it only draws you into creating more suffering, the patterns for more suffering. I sometimes compare it to a honey coated razor blade. So you lick at the honey because it seems so delicious, but you get cut in the end, right? Because you got this sharp razor blade underneath the honey. That's the same thing with regard to all these pleasurable experiences. They don't have the nature of providing true happiness. And of course, that is their fault. That is the fault from the side of the object. But we've got to learn to work with our own minds to cut off that desire so we don't keep creating the causes for our own suffering, our own pain. You know? Okay, so this idea of getting stuck, I really like that he emphasizes, because like I said, you can actually find Pema Chodron's teachings on this are in Taking the Leap, a wonderful little book that has all of her little teachings on Shenpa and how we get stuck by that. Like a body fastened with chains, the mind is fastened with attachment. The mind is tied, controlled, chained by attachment. The mind is stuck like glue to the object. Attachment is the mind stuck to an object. I know Rinpoche is kind of rubbing our nose in it here to some degree, just keep saying the same thing over and over again. But I think we really need to hear this, because once more, we have the pattern of going to those objects of pleasure and thinking that somehow this is good for us. You know, we've convinced ourselves that it's great to have these things and it's great to have these experiences and it's nice to be cushy and comfortable and all these things. Well, I mean, they do induce feelings of happiness. As I said, there's no denying that. But you can have those happiness feelings without the attachment. That's the key to all of this, is if we can find a way to work with our own minds to lessen the attachment, then it doesn't matter whether you have the happiness experiences, the unhappiness experiences, the comfortable experiences, the uncomfortable experiences, whatever the case might be, because your mind's going to be at peace. Your mind isn't going to be getting bent out of shape. As we talked previously, these 8 worldly dharmas are the perfect example of how we're like a yo-yo. We just go up when we get all the wonderful things in our life, and then we get a unexpected bill, or something horrible happens to us, and our mind plummets. We get so depressed. You know, this is that kind of, again, bipolar nature that I was speaking about, and I'm not trying to be kind of insensitive to those who are diagnosed with bipolar. As Venerable Robina says, all these things are just a matter of, extremes. When we diagnose it as something as being out of control, that's because it's an extreme, but we're all like this. We're all in these same patterns of being very up and energetic and feeling good about ourselves when everything's going right. And then the second things go wrong, we become just a mess, become horribly depressed and so hard to comfort and what have you. Well, this is our own fault. It's our own minds, because these things are going to happen. This is a nature of samsara, to have these objects of praise and criticism, material gain and loss, and so on. So Rinpoche says then, desiring makes having these 4, again, the material things, the comfort, again, the translation in this said interesting sounds, but the general one is a good reputation. So the first one has to do with material stuff. The second one has to do with the comfortable, pleasurable experiences that we crave, the good reputation generally that we desire to have in the world, in our little circle or what have you, but then the praise we receive directly from people. All of these are made a problem, Rinpoche says, because we have desire. If there's no desire, no worldly concern, having or not having these objects does not become a problem. We know this to be true too, because we can see it in the world, in others who have maybe, again, practice teachings along this line a little bit more deeply, who don't get so bent out of shape when things happen. We can see that they have much more of an even state of mind, because there's no desire. The thought of the worldly dharmas clings to the 4 desirable objects of this life. Without this thought, there is so much calmness and peace in your mind that meeting the 4 undesirable objects doesn't bother you. If we have peace with the pleasurable side of it, then we're going to have peace with the unpleasurable side of it, right? Because the unpleasurable side of it is simply you not getting what you wanted over on the pleasurable side. Wanting that material gain, well, and if you lose things and your investments go down or whatever the case might be, or you lose your job, all the money that you cling to and desire, well, if you don't have that, well, then you don't have the mind that gets bent out of shape when that happens. The craving and clinging on the one side causes the pain and anguish on the other side. If we don't have such attachment to it, we won't have the pain of being separated from it. Now, again, it's understandable that in this life you're going to want some measure of these things in your life, to have things good enough for you to be able to use this life well. But what are we doing, once more, in relation to those objects? That's the problem. The clinging, the desire, the craving, the grasping, what have you, all of that is the problem. If we're not able to be with those objects, which we all have in our lives, the money in the bank, the comfortable home to live in, whatever, if we aren't able to be with those objects without that, they are going to become the source of more suffering for us. This is what Rinpoche is clearly pointing out to us. But once more, we have to wake up to this reality. And meeting the four desirable objects doesn't bother you. So you don't get like a yo-yo again, where you get all bent out of shape when things go bad, as was said in the previous slide. And you also don't get like totally elated and out of control when you get the four desirable objects. If someone praises you, he says, it doesn't matter. If someone criticizes you, it cannot disturb your mind. There's stability in your life and peace of mind. There are no ups and downs. This is equalizing the 8 worldly dharmas, keeping your mind at peace so that those experiences aren't going to upset the peace that you have, because you aren't getting caught up in them. You aren't getting stuck to them, clinging to them. Remember, there was someone who asked a question, I don't know if it was last week or I think it was the week before, about whether what we want to do is kind of transform the view of that which is pleasurable into being unpleasurable, so that we kind of reduce that. I mean, there are techniques of working with some of this idea to see kind of the unpleasant aspects of that which is pleasurable and what have you. At this point, the goal is, though, is to have the mind that's going to be more at peace with regard to whatever is happening. I think I shared in one of the previous classes the whole story of the Taoist farmer who, again, I would just encapsulate that in like a sentence or two, who essentially, when he deals with calamity, something going wrong, the neighbor's all concerned, but he's like, oh, who knows if it's good or bad? And then, of course, it turns out that there's actually a good side to what was perceived as bad, but then the neighbor comes over and says, oh, how good? And then, of course, there's always a bad side potentially to what's good. This is the nature of samsara, right? We don't know that what's actually going to happen minute by minute, much less day by day or year by year. Our situations change. Everything is subject to some level of impermanence. And of course, in the interconnected world that we live in, things can change really quickly. I mean, look at how quickly things changed just over a year ago in terms of what our lives were and what our lives became in terms of this pandemic. So this is the nature of existence, is that things are going to change. How are you going to maintain your mind? Now, there are, again, these more advanced techniques of working with seeing even the unpleasant stuff as something that we can really bite our teeth into and be delighted to experience. Those are the higher level of Lojong teachings, where, like Rinpoche, when he talks about problems and difficulties, he said we should learn to like them in the same way we like ice cream. Well, that's a pretty tough practice. Right now, I'm just saying, just see the problem as something that happens and that we can acknowledge it happens. See the pleasant experience as something that happens and that we can acknowledge simply happens. Try to be with things without the mind that gets caught up in it, the mind of desire. So let's go into a little bit more of what Rinpoche, how he, because it's coming up very soon, will be the actual advice that he's giving for how we can contemplate getting rid of this desire. So how do you keep your mind peaceful when problems happen? How do you protect your mind so that experiencing the 4 undesirable things does not disturb you? And we could add in there, how do you protect your mind so that experiencing the 4 desirable things does not disturb you? Or does not, make you go out of control, crazy, what have you, by realizing that clinging to these 4 desirable objects is the problem. So therefore, we need to cut our desire, our clinging. This is the big issue. You have to realize the shortcomings of these 4 desirable objects and abandon clinging to them. This is the basic psychology. If you use this method, undesirable situations will not disturb you. And again, the desirable situations will not, catch you into the patterns that we've been experiencing previously. All of the desire, again, that keeps us in an unhealthy relationship with those objects. Excuse me. So this is where we get into what I've highlighted as the 3 main things that Rinpoche emphasizes in terms of techniques or things to keep in mind to cut off desire by seeing its shortcomings. Seeing the shortcomings, again, we can look at the objects themselves, as was mentioned in there, and we will talk about that as part of this. But the idea here is we have to see desire's shortcomings. We have to see how that mind state of attachment, of imbuing these pleasant experiences with an exaggerated quality of pleasure, grasping at them, not wanting to be separated from them. And again, this can be happening at very slight levels. It can be happening at grosser levels, such as what an addict has in terms of the substance that they're abusing. So the very first one is realize how desire only leads to dissatisfaction, and it actually blocks true peace and happiness in the moment. I think this is one of the things that we have to convince ourselves of and work with, because the mind of attachment that is going after these desirable objects, whether we are, again, in a store and going around shopping, looking at various things, or we're online and we're trying to find something, whatever, that almost seems like it's a very pleasant experience. Why? Because it's about going after objects of pleasure. Even if we're not experiencing the pleasurable object yet, we're filled with pleasure because we're chasing after them. But we have to come to see that that isn't actually a very peaceful state of mind. Again, that's junkie mentality, just at a much lower degree than the level of somebody who is totally addicted to a substance or what have you. But we know even with something like shopping, people can become shopping addicts, right? They can get to that point where they are driven by that type of activity and it becomes an addiction for them, and they end up overspending and they have huge credit card balances and what have you, because they don't have an ability to control the mind of desire. Well, we all have it at some level when we are out shopping or doing whatever, but the mind of desire seems like it's not disturbing to us. It actually seems like it's helping us get what we want. So we mentioned earlier, it seems like our best friend, and it's not our best friend. It's actually the enemy. It's actually what will keep you from having peace. So let's look at what Rinpoche says on this first point. If you feel that by sacrificing desire, you are sacrificing your happiness and are being left with nothing, remember that all your problems are based on desire and the thought of the worldly dharmas. Not knowing that the nature of desire is suffering, you cannot see that there is a better happiness. Again, Rinpoche sometimes calls this the happiness of Dharma. And I think it is something we need to have some faith in if we haven't experienced it yet. I think most of us probably have to some degree. When we turn our minds towards Dharma and begin to know the peace that is attainable on the inside, the peace that is attainable not just through developing deeper concentration, which they say, again, I haven't developed that in state like calm abiding or anything like this, but they say that you attain unbelievable states of bliss and well-being just by focusing the mind on a virtuous object or something that doesn't allow it to move off in these directions. We don't know that peace so much yet. Most people don't. Again, I'm not saying that everyone here, none of you have had any experience of the happiness of Dharma. But as long as we are following these habitual patterns of craving for these eight worldly concerns, we are not going to know that happiness. We have to convince ourselves initially that there is a happiness that will supplant that is a better happiness. I mentioned this previously. His Holiness often talks about how the mind has supremacy because we can be in difficult situations, some people, again, with very challenging situations, and be quite okay with it. But if we have a disturbed mind, even if we're in a pleasant situation, it doesn't do much for us, right? If we're stewing with anger or what have you, if our mind is out of control in that way, even somebody, offers you something really delicious, delightful, you kind of like, it doesn't seem the same. Why? Because your mind is so disturbed. The external objects are not what determine, excuse me, not what determine really our happiness. It's the internal processes that determine our happiness. So we have to begin to have some confidence in that we can actually develop deeper states of well-being and happiness that will disallow then our involvement in these eight worldly concerns. This is the way of seeing, again, that their shortcomings, their faults, are that they only lead to dissatisfaction. Whereas if we don't follow them, we actually end up with a deeper state of happiness. Again, the happiness of Dharma. Rinpoche continues, quoting Lama Tsongkhapa. He says, as Lama Tsongkhapa mentions, this is the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise on the path to enlightenment, here called the Great Commentary on the Graduated Path. We follow desire in the hope of getting satisfaction, but following desire leads only to dissatisfaction. So Rinpoche says, in reality, the result of following desire is only dissatisfaction. You try again and again and again, but there is only dissatisfaction. Again, like that Rolling Stone, who says you can't get no satisfaction. So again, this is the reality, is that we keep getting dissatisfied by following desire. It doesn't ultimately satisfy. But we can become satisfied if we go within, if we actually look for the source of satisfaction within ourselves. Rinpoche says, as I mentioned, the nature of attachment is like that. It is not really peaceful. It is actually painful, and life is constantly suffering. Again, we can see it when it's in grosser forms in people, or maybe some of you have struggled with your own issues around alcohol, substance abuse, what have you. You can see how painful those patterns are when they manifest in that way. But do we see how painful they are when we have attachment to a delicious meal or to some other experience that brings us pleasure or happiness? So Rinpoche says, you can see now what it means to practice Dharma. What it really, really means to practice Dharma is this one. So these are actually a few slides I'm sharing from the course of the Living in the Path that's called the Happiness of Dharma. These are based on teachings that Rinpoche gave at the Light of the Path retreat. I think this one was in the 2010, if my recollection is correct, this module of that's called the Happiness of Dharma. So what it really means to practice Dharma is to find the peace that is within, that isn't caught up in these patterns of attachment, that is already there at some level, even before we've set foot on the path to some degree. As I mentioned, this cutting off desire is what we need to do right at the beginning, before we can even really practice the Dharma in any genuine way. This means, Rinpoche says, you're totally free. Again, you're not stuck. You're not imprisoned by these things. Your heart, your mind, by letting go of this desire, attachment, has unbelievable peace and happiness. You are totally free, and there's unbelievable peace and happiness in this life. I mean, Rinpoche's can speak to this. If you've ever received teachings from Rinpoche, you know that he embodies all of these principles to such a great degree. And if you spend any time around him over the course of a couple of weeks retreat or what have you, you see that he has no worldly desires at all. I mean, I'm amazed he will sit in his sitting posture teaching for hours and hours without even moving. And most of the audience, I mean, myself included, moving my legs and trying to find a more comfortable position and trying, you know, and here's Rinpoche just totally fine with it. He's not disturbed by anything that's going on, whatever is happening with his body. But we just see even those little subtle ways that there's a mind at peace. Whereas the mind that's agitated and always wanting things to be this or that. Remember, I mentioned last week about how when I first saw Rinpoche in 1996 in San Francisco, someone had brought their two little kids and they were in the back of the room and kept saying things like, "I'm cold, I'm tired, I'm hungry." All of the things that, of course, everyone in the Gompa was feeling the same way, that we just weren't vocalizing them. But this is what's going on constantly, is like we are craving and clinging to those desires. That is not a peaceful mind. We are convinced through the force of our past behavior that that is part of the whole thing of pleasure and getting happiness. That if we have this mind that is constantly looking to fill that gap, to fulfill whatever needs we have at the time, that that's actually part and parcel of getting our happiness. But it's actually not. It disturbs our peace. The peace that we could experience from a mind that is still and not going to those places is something that we have to initially have some conviction that that's possible, but secondly, actually experience it, through cutting off our desire by first seeing that it's unsatisfactory. This is not a way to achieve what we are actually seeking, because that fundamental desire to be happy and to not suffer isn't the problem. The problem is the way we're going about achieving that. And then Rinpoche concludes, he says, then everything comes to you. Like Lama Yeshe said, everything comes to you when you are free of that desire. From your side, there is no thought of seeking, no attachment at all, but everything comes. As he's quoting, paraphrasing perhaps what Lama Yeshe said, that we don't have that desire that is seeking those things, that is going after those things, that craving, that clinging. Everything comes yet. Without that mind, things still appear. You still have your meal, you still have your money in the bank, you still have all these things, but you have a peaceful mind. It's as a result of the power of Dharma, everything comes. And the deeper thing that comes is, of course, your inner happiness and contentment that is not going like a yo-yo all over the place, but rather is being experienced in every moment because you're not contingent upon those external situations. The second point, recall how desire leads to other afflictions and the problems that ensue. This is something we've already alluded to a little bit earlier because we talked about how with these pairs, the 8 pairs, you have the 4 on the one side that we have the desire to get, and then we have the 4 on the other side that we have the desire to avoid. But they are both a desire that's involved here. But essentially what we said is, of course, when you have the mind of craving and clinging to material gain or to praise or whatever, then we get quite angry and upset. That's kind of the initial indicator of how attached we were. I mentioned this previously as well, right? Those things that we are quite attached to, we know that if something happens to them or they get pulled out from under us, we get quite disturbed then. The mind is very unhappy then. Well, that already is showing that we're going to have problems because we're going to have an upset mind. We're going to have a mind that gets angry at whatever it was that took those away from us or that is threatening that. We're going to have all the complications that come from anger in our lives if we still have this drive of desire that's underneath our quest for happiness that is kind of getting us in trouble essentially. So again, let's continue with what Rinpoche says in regard to how desire leads to these other afflictions, all the problems that we have in samsara. So he once more quotes Lama Tsongkhapa, kind of continuing with what he was saying previously in regard to the unsatisfactory nature of desire. Desire brings so many other problems. Through following desire, the mind becomes rough and unpeaceful. That's the initial one. Our mind is just not at peace, but we have so many other things that come from it. Rinpoche says hundreds of problems come from dissatisfaction, which is there because we follow the mind of desire. When there is very strong desire, it is very easy to become angry, for example. As I was just pointing out, the degree to which we are attached to something, and we can see by when we don't have it, and especially when someone else threatens it or takes it away from us, how angry and upset we get, how much that disturbs our very peace at that moment. You know, it was already disturbed by the mind of clinging, and now it's even more disturbed by the mind of anger. We're up in the waves that are crashing all over the place. The stronger the clinging, the stronger the anger that arises. If you don't cling very much, you don't get so angry when someone upsets you. You might still be disturbed, but less than before. I think this, is maybe a little exercise I'd encourage you to work with over the next week, is that you've already identified to some degree those things that you are your objects of desire within the 8 worldly dharmas, because each of these you could find particular things within them. For example, comfort. Well, what things of comfort do you like in your life that you think are so important to have that you might even get angry and upset if you went to the store to buy something that is the source of that and you weren't able to find it? But we can maybe do a little investigation when we have that moment of anger or something that's in that stage of irritation, annoyance, all the way up to a deeper sense of anger. Is there attachment at work there? Is there that craving and clinging to that is causing the anger then to arise? If that's what's right underneath the surface, is our desire to always have that thing, well, then it's going to play a part, obviously, in the aversion and the anger energy that arises when we don't get that. The degree to which we have those things, as Rinpoche says, is very much influenced by the degree of our attachment to those objects. If we don't have the attachment to the objects, it's not going to matter, whether we experience them or not. Anger, jealousy, and so forth, he says, arise in relation to clinging. I was pointing out earlier about, when we see these things happen, family situations or whatever, and they're very sad stories when we hear that, like on an episode of Dateline or on the television, TV news or whatever, when they talk about horrible situations where people end up killing their loved ones or doing, horrible harm to their loved ones. It's just such a twisted state of mind because the fundamental desire was the attachment to having what one wants. And when one doesn't get that, then the mind goes out of control with jealousy, with anger, And these are horrific stories when we hear them, right? When someone, for example, might kill their partner because they want to break up with them and they don't want anyone else to have them. Well, what is that about? It's about the clinging to that person as mine, as needing to be there for me, and therefore I'm going to do harm to that person because I'm so attached to you. I mean, it sounds strange. It sounds so twisted, but this is what the mind does under the control of desire. Because of clinging, Rinpoche says, these other negative thoughts arise. When any of these negative thoughts arise, you create negative karma, the cause of the lower realms. This is the whole gist of this, is that we really have to see that, again, the problems that we have in terms of the peace we don't experience, in terms of the, let me take this off for a moment, in terms of the delusions that arise, in terms of the things that we might do or say, that's only what we experience in this moment, in this life, right? So say, yeah, somebody does take that away from you or threatens that, and then you get really angry and upset at them, and you get all red-faced and yell at them and scream at them, and you don't feel so good for several days, and maybe later you apologize to them or whatever. That's the more immediate experience that shows that it's not such a healthy thing to do, to have that desire in the first place. But we haven't even talked about what are you going to experience further down the road. All the negative karma we create every time we follow a non-virtuous state of mind. The non-virtuous states, of course, of the three root delusions. I'm going to give a little, actually might want to wait till after the break for this, but let's just talk about the three root delusions first, which again are the mind of attachment, anger or aversion, energy. Those are the two we've been mostly talking about, right? That they are caught up in those pleasurable objects that we get attached to, that we crave, that we don't want to be separated from, and then the unpleasant ones that we want to push out of our lives, and we might even harm in the process of getting rid of those. Those two are by their nature non-virtuous. Whenever attachment is present in the mind, you have non-virtue. Whenever there is anger in the mind, you have non-virtue. Then when we talk about ignorance, maybe we'll get into this a little bit after the break, there we have to qualify that, because it's only when ignorance gives rise to other non-virtuous states of mind that it becomes non-virtuous. Because you can have ignorance present with your virtuous states of mind. It sounds kind of strange, but when we talk about the deeper level of ignorance, that is this clinging to a sense of self and I, that can be present even when you're being generous to other people. Because most of us will have that operative in our lives until we do the deeper work to remove that error. That's not going to be a part of this course. That's kind of, things I've talked about previously in other teachings. And but that's how we remove that fault of ignorance through the wisdom realizing emptiness. But that ignorance can actually be present with our virtuous states of mind. So ignorance by its nature, in terms of this ignorance that is grasping at the I to inherently exist, thinking that I have that level of existence when I don't, that ignorance is not by its nature non-virtuous. It can be virtuous or non-virtuous depending upon what it gives rise to. You can still have that strong clinging and again have a very compassionate mind, but you can also have that mind of self-clinging and have a very disturbed mind that's angry and upset and jealous. It's just a matter of how we move from that place of ignorance. Sometimes we move into more virtuous territory, and that's the only way we can create virtue right now. Eventually, if we've removed that ignorance, we can create uncontaminated virtue, virtue that is pure, virtue that will actually give rise to more lasting results. But the pleasurable things that we create the causes for and through these virtuous mind, again, those things do have faults within them, but that's the only way we can create them at this time. Good rebirths, good situations, whatever, they're all created together with ignorance. They will eventually be free of that when we can remove that ignorance. But here we're talking about, again, much more immediate steps as to what we can do to stop these non-virtuous states of mind arising. Because once the mind of attachment arises, it flavors the whole experience as non-virtue. It creates non-virtue, which means it creates the result of suffering. If you have anger present in the mind, exactly the same thing. So we want to keep those non-virtues from arising, especially, again, the attachment, the clinging to the pleasure of this life. Why? Because the problems that ensue are not just in this life. It's not just the crazy mind that we have in the moment that is chasing after those things and wanting to avoid the opposite. It is the mind that actually produces our future suffering. So the problems go way beyond just the experience in this life and the problems that we have right now. And that's something, again, we have to generate some conviction in through our own study of karma and what have you. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about karma as we go through the remainder of today. But so it's about 11:04. Let's call it 11:05. So at 11:15, we'll reconvene and we'll carry on. If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat box, and then that way I'll know that they're there to answer. Okay, I'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Work with that awareness in that moment. So, of course, the big thing, first of all, is having the wherewithal and the mindfulness to know that something's going astray. That's why, again, when we have some of the coarser delusions like anger and what have you, sometimes those are pretty obvious, but even those we might not be, quite on top of and have the mindful awareness to know that that's going on. With desire, desire is very subtle. Again, this mind of attachment, it's happening a good part of our day. And so we have to be really attuned to that and know exactly what it looks like. What is the flavor of desire? Venerable Rabina talks about these being kind of like our crazy roommates. So we have to know each of our crazy roommates and what their patterns are and when they show up, what hours of the day, in response to various things, what have you. So the first thing, of course, is to be able to identify that that is actually you're moving in a non-virtuous direction. Sometimes, depending upon the strength of what's going on or the weakness of what's going on, that may be enough. It's kind of like, the idea that if you, shine a light on it, well, then sometimes that's enough to cause it to stop. Once you see that it's actually happening, that may be good enough to be able to keep it from moving forward. Other times we may need something that's a little more advanced, more forceful, and that would really depend once more on what it is in particular that's arising and what types of antidotes we might use to counteract those. Uh, in terms of just in general, anytime we see non-virtue arising, I think what Rinpoche is pointing out here, the things that we're going through are really useful. One, to see again that this isn't going to lead to any real satisfaction. Whether you're talking about the mind of craving and desire that is there in a default mode, or whether you talk about anger, anger doesn't get you to what you want either. We might think, oh, well, yeah, I put them in their place and then they backed off and I was the victor. But did you really gain anything from that? You know, we don't feel so good when we've had those sorts of interactions with others, even if we've got the upper hand at the end. So we have to recognize that there's not a lot of benefit to it, that it's only going to cause further problems down the road, that it really isn't something that produces any real lasting peace or happiness. And also what we're going to go into next, which is the fact that it really blocks our practice of the Dharma. Every time we follow a mind of non-virtue, we only strengthen that habit. We've already got it so habituated from prior lifetimes, we don't need to strengthen it anymore. In fact, we need to strengthen the opposite, the lack of desire, the lack of anger, what have you, and the more virtuous thoughts that we can introduce in those situations. So it's very hard to answer that question in terms of everything that could possibly be used at the time when non-virtue is arising, because it depends upon what sort of non-virtuous state is there, because some of them, again, do have very specific antidotes that we could think about. But, and then it also might depend upon the strength or the weakness of what's going on in terms of how much we need to introduce something else that would counteract that. As I said, sometimes just having the awareness of it is enough for it to diminish. But in general, if we think of the faults of non-virtue, the faults of the afflictions, if we recognize that they aren't our friend, that they aren't coming in there to protect us, sometimes anger even seems like that, right? It's like your big brother or big sister that would come to your aid when you were getting picked on by other kids or something, you know? And that's how it feels. It feels like it's a protector. It's something that's going to be there for your benefit, but it actually isn't. It isn't providing that at all because it has faults to it and it will only lead to future suffering, more problems, more difficulties. So I think at this level of practice, that's probably the best way. Bring the mindful awareness to it, see if you can diminish it to some degree, and then also think about the faults of following that. I'll just introduce a few of these in terms of how we would counteract it with more direct antidotes, but you have to have some familiarity with those antidotes for them to work. That's the problem. So it requires some other meditation on these things for them to be able to stick at that moment. For example, if you're angry, hateful at a person, well, you can, they say, the traditional kind of antidote to that is to generate love and compassion for them. Why? Because you see that they're a suffering being who's under the control of their delusions, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. They wouldn't be doing it if they were, a compassionate, caring, loving being. So we can have compassion and love for them, but that's a really hard one to apply in the moment, right? When somebody's in your face and screaming at you or doing something, having compassion and love for them, if you're not familiar with that, you're not going to have much strength to that state of mind that's going to counteract it in the moment. So any of these non-virtuous states of mind, when they arise, are going to require different antidotes depending upon where we're at in our own practice and what is going on at the moment. As I said, sometimes just being still and looking at it and not kind of being aware of what's going on, maybe even bringing the awareness to the breath. That was actually some of the instructions I think many of us got when we were quite young, in terms of if something happened that annoyed us, that upset us, to just count to 10, right? To spend 10 seconds of just, and hopefully it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Like you do 1, 2, 3, you actually sit quietly and see what's going on, kind of be your own observer at that point. And that may be enough sometimes to create some space. But it really depends upon the degree of what you're experiencing and how that is troubling you at that moment. So I don't know if I can say more than that. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit more later in the course if we've got some time. But I think seeing the disadvantages of these states of mind and really recognizing that they're not our friend. They appear that way. They think like they're going to protect us from future suffering and they're going to, bring us happiness, but they actually aren't doing that. And of course, if we can keep the non-virtuous thoughts from manifesting, that's great. But at this stage, for most of us, it's keeping the non-virtuous actions of body and speech from arising, right? Keep the mouth shut. Venerable Robina, can I quote her so much because she's one of my main teachers, but um, she has that wonderful phrase she learned when she was young, which was zip your lip and keep your hands to yourself. That's the idea behind our basic morality and our basic curtailing our non-virtue, is just keep your mouth shut. Stop saying things, texting things, emailing things, whatever, that are going to be hurtful to others and what have you, that only create more complication. And then keep your hands to yourself. Don't mess with other people's stuff, with their well-being, with what have you. Don't injure them through your words or through your deeds. So that's the basic thing, to make sure that when non-virtue is arising, that it doesn't go spill over into those sorts of things. If we're only seeing it at the mental level, well, it's bad that it's at the mental level, but hey, we got to learn to work with our minds, folks. So be patient with yourself in that process. And there's another question from Venerable Pemo. Please clarify what is happening in our mind in regards to the 4 objects of desire. Is it that we are craving or wanting or longing or something? Or can it be that we like the object? Example, we like to receive things, gifts, enjoyable objects, happiness. Venerable Pema, it's a really good question, because I think that we have to distinguish, as your question is pointing out, just the enjoyment of the sensation, that is happening. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, and maybe I'll just refresh this with everybody, we're mostly talking about these 2 poles of experience that are simply feeling tones. We have a pleasant feeling tone when we get the comfortable thing, when we have that thing that induces that for us. And that may be different for most of us, right? We might have certain things that we have in common, certain things that we all like to hear or experience. But for many of us, it's quite unique to our own individual being, the things that we find comfortable, that we enjoy, and what have you. That is sort of a karmic ripening of our past good karma that results in a pleasant experience. On the other hand, we have the unpleasant experiences that are results of our past negative karma. Those experiences of what we call pleasure and pain, or pleasure and displeasure, are just that, feeling tones. They induce that pleasurable experience within ourselves, that kind of happening. I don't know if that would be quite the liking of something at that stage, but it's mostly when we begin the process of embellishing that we have the problem of desire. Again, recall that the qualities of this mind of attachment, that is attached to getting what we want, attached to not getting what we don't want, that mind is going to embellish qualities on top of that. In other words, it's going to make what it already seems like it's pleasurable into something that is more than that, that has greater pleasure to it, and that is inherent within the object. We start superimposing all of that on the object that isn't actually there. That's the error that that mind is making right from the beginning. In regard to what is unpleasant, it is superimposing negative qualities. And of course, being attached to not having those negative qualities because we see them as so unfavorable that we don't want to experience them. So the kind of, I don't know, I mean, it's hard to just differentiate these words in English, but the sort of liking, if it's simply the matter that, when something pleasant comes in, that we experience that happiness and we enjoy it, I don't think there's a fault right there. It's when we begin to throw more pleasure on top of that. And as I said, we can see this process if we begin to slow down our minds and take a look at what's actually happening. For most of us, when we hear a really beautiful piece of music that we become attached to, we are imbuing it with all sorts of things that are beyond what are in the actual notes. I mean, when it comes down to it, all there are is movement of molecules that create sound that we hear through our ears, and that's all that is really happening at the very base level. The fact that we are hearing it as something pleasant, as I said, is due to our own karma, that we have various objects that we experience as pleasant that are not going to be identical, again, to what everyone else experiences as pleasant. So once we overlay on top of that a pleasantness that is more than the initial experience of that, this is what happens again with most of us in terms of objects of desire, is that they become a part and parcel of our experience because we keep embellishing them with that, and we need them then to produce that. So the wanting, longing, craving, I think these are all in the territory of the mind of desire. Craving is probably, again, a greater, more heightened sense of desire, but the wanting or longing for something is definitely involved in that embellishment, because it starts to take on a role of, once more, we get stuck in it. The object seems to be necessary in order for us to have our happiness, and we keep going after it and wanting not to be separated from it, all these additional thoughts that follow. But it's the initial step of embellishing it with additional qualities that are not there. Now, again, we can't say that the pleasantness even that we experience in the initial moment is there from the side of the object, because once more, not everybody who has that initial experience with that object experiences it as pleasurable. Uh, Again, I go back to music because, as I said, I know it's something I struggle with in terms of my own attachment. Say you really like classical music, and there's a piece of classical music that you've really gotten to enjoy, that you loved, like when you have your moments where you just go, oh, I just really need to listen to that piece, and you put it on and you just feel so good. Well, you are obviously embellishing that. Even at that moment where you're craving and longing for it and putting it on and wanting to hear it and wanting to experience the sound of those notes and whatever the instruments are. But as I said, that classical music, that piece of music, you could play for somebody who despises classical music, and they would not hear one atom of pleasure from the side of that music, right? That's because fundamentally that's what's going on. Everything is empty of that. It doesn't have those qualities from its own side. They are entirely coming from the side of the subject, the person who's experiencing them. So whether it's experienced as pleasant or unpleasant, obviously, there is that bottom line that nothing is there from the side of the object. That's, of course, the wisdom we want to achieve much further down the road, so that we recognize the empty nature of all things. Nonetheless, things will still have some pleasing characteristic to them on the basis of our karma with them, some unpleasing characteristic on the basis of a different karma we have with those objects. But that's sort of the baseline of that initial experience of pleasure or unpleasantness. And then we embellish. We embellish on top of that. That's when we start moving into the territory of wanting, longing, desiring, craving, grasping. I mean, all these things that show a process whereby we can become incredibly addicted to the things that we have in our lives and not want to be without them. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's very hard to differentiate it in terms of the words. I think, again, all the words you use at the beginning are definitely in the nature of desire. But to simply have a like for something, I'm not so sure that that's necessarily the case. It just means that, again, that induced that particular pleasant experience with you, and you like it, you enjoy it. I always go back to that one thing that Venerable Rabina shares frequently, where she says Lama Yeshe is renowned for having said, the more pleasure, the better, dear. The pleasure isn't the problem. And of course, then liking the pleasure, having the experience of the pleasure isn't the problem. It's everything we do that's over and above that. That's why I think, this is the hardest mind to work with. I really am appreciating this opportunity to study this material once more and to present it, because it's pointing out a lot of things in myself that I really need to be more attentive to. But desire is one of the hardest ones for us to actually get at, because it becomes part and parcel of the experience and the object. We don't really see it as being something that is outside of it. We think it's part of the actual experience of the pleasantness of that object, what it's inducing in us. So I saw someone had a hand up, but let me go to these. Do we stop liking to have happiness? I think again, it's the overindulgence in things that we once we start creating more qualities from the side of the object, that becomes the problem. The actual experience of them, I don't think, again, is the problem. Are we cultivating a mind of not liking and not disliking? Again, I think I've answered that. Okay. Liking when we have happiness, not liking when we do not have happiness. Is that what we're aiming for? um, Again, if you put it in that way, liking when we have happiness, not liking when we don't, then it starts sounding like craving. Sorry, I'm having a little conversation here, I guess, with Venerable Pemo in terms of her comments. But I think that this is the problem. Again, when we feel like we need to have that thing, again, maybe need and like sounds like different things, but we really like having that. We really want that experience to continue. That's because we've embellished it. We've given it those qualities, and we think that those qualities are there, and we need to be that with them. We can't be without them. But I think it's happening really often, as I said, in quite subtle levels. You hear a piece of music for the first time, and then maybe you're not even, it's producing some pleasantness. But we've even had that experience, right, where you've had something, maybe it's a food that you ate at one time when you were a kid that you went back to as an adult, and you actually enjoy it as an adult, whereas as a kid, you didn't want to eat it at all. So you change, and your karma changes with relation to various objects. But I think this idea of the minute that we, or the second that we are grasping at it on the basis of thinking it has those qualities there inherently, and that there are even more qualities than what we are experiencing, that it has a greater opportunity to induce that pleasantness. I don't know. It's an interesting conversation, because I think this is something that we all have to do in our own sort of meditation and begin to become much clearer about, is when does that mind of desire become operative? And what is it like? I think that this is also, maybe again, I had the experiment that I encouraged you to do earlier today, which was to kind of see when the mind of anger or aversion is arising, can we see how desire is playing a role in that? That underneath, what is it that's causing you to be triggered by the neighbor making noise or whatever, that you then kind of go, oh, it's because I'm desiring to have a peaceful, quiet environment wherever I'm at. And is that a realistic expectation? But in this case, I mean, what I might encourage you to do is to try to be with an object that is inducing pleasantness for you. And maybe it is even an object that you do recognize you have attachment to, but try to be with the pleasure without the mind of desire being there. And then you can begin to see how pervasive the desire is, because it arises quite quickly in regard to these objects, because we are so acclimated to having that as our default mode. I think it's a pretty difficult mind to identify, and it's a difficult mind to separate from. But it's not the one that most people start with. Again, that's why the emphasis often goes to anger and those more inflamed types of emotions, because those are really problematic for us in terms of our relationships with others, in terms of our relationships with the immediate things in our own world and with our own well-being. Attachment is much more fundamental. But as I said, they are part and parcel of each other. We do have that desire to not experience the unpleasant and to experience the pleasant. And that, of course, is complicating all of it and making us have these minds of anger, frustration, what have you, when we don't get what we want. So does anyone else have anything to share on this? I'm not by any means the only person in the Gompa, in the Zoom room, who has experience around working with this. Anyone want to share anything from their own insight through anyone? Okay. So I think we have to be attentive to anything that is moving in that direction and recognize that it's going to become problematic. So can we be with these pleasant experiences? Can we be even with the unpleasant experiences without the mind of desire arising. The mind that desires it to continue to be this way if it's pleasant, the desire that doesn't want it to continue to be that way if it's unpleasant. That's a tough one too. I mean, I'm not saying that's an easier one, but all of this revolves around desire. I think this is why Rinpoche wrote this book and taught on this text, is because he saw how deeply ingrained desire is. Remember that this all goes back to the very first session when we talked about how Rinpoche began this book with the statement about how until he found this opening the door of Dharma text in a cave of his former reincarnation, the Laudo Lama, that until he found that text, he thought he realized he hadn't been practicing Dharma at all. Now, if Rinpoche says that again, we can take it perhaps with, that understanding. This is Rinpoche in his amazing, beneficent mind that is giving us this kind of identification with our deluded states. But nonetheless, I think that we all have to look at this and say, what does that mean for me then? I'm not Lama Zopa Rinpoche by any means, so I have to look at this and go, how do I take the advice in this text and actually begin to apply it in terms of my own understanding of, am I really practicing Dharma every day? We all do a lot of practices and things that we call Dharma. We sit down to meditate and we read Dharma books and we recite sutras perhaps, or mantras or various other things. We do our water bowl offerings. We do all these various things, that are part of prostrations, various things that we do as part of our spiritual practice. But are they really spiritual practice? Are they really Dharma? We have to keep going back to that idea from the very beginning, because this is what this text is here to help us investigate, is to see to what degree do I have some attachment still to the comforts of this life, to the pleasurable things of this life that I don't want to let go of, that I think are actually more important perhaps than Dharma, because I haven't been convinced of how the ability for Dharma to produce happiness, the ability for me to actually gain a deeper sense of well-being through practicing the Buddhist teachings. Okay, so let me go back to the slides and just do this last section. Again, these are the three things that I feel Rinpoche was really highlighting in this very important chapter called Cutting Off Desire, to realize how it only leads to dissatisfaction, so it blocks our true peace and happiness in the moment. If you really want to be happy, then you don't have that mind of craving present, so that you can be with those pleasant experiences and not get caught up in patterns of dissatisfaction, patterns that only lead to no peace in the mind whatsoever. Recall how desire leads to other afflictions and the problems that ensue, which of course are the actions that we engage in through our speech and our physical actions on the basis of these disturbing states of mind like jealousy, pride, anger, what have you, that all follow from our desire. Third, this is what we're going to talk about now, and this is a little bit longer section because it has a few more quotes from the text opening the door of Dharma that Rinpoche has been alluding to in this book. Recognize how desire keeps us from progressing on the path of Dharma. We all like to profess that we are Buddhists, that we are practicing Mahayana Buddhism, that we are wanting to become enlightened for the sake of all beings, and da-da-da. Well, if we are driven by desire, we are never going to really progress on the path of Dharma to these greater accomplishments, because all we're going to do is just keep getting caught up, even in a lifetime where we meet with the Dharma, even in a lifetime where we have, as I pointed out in my meditation today, the light of the Dharma in our lives through this precious human life that we've obtained. Will we use it to its best benefit? So here Rinpoche says, as long as we desire comfort, material things, respect, and a good reputation, and as long as we wish to avoid discomfort, not acquiring things, disrespect, and a bad reputation, every action is motivated by attachment. As long as that is our default mode that is guiding us, that desire, that wants all these, the four pleasurable things, doesn't want to experience the four unpleasant things, well, then we're going to have, a mind, or all of our actions motivated by attachment, not just attachment, but then of course hatred that arises when we don't get what we want, or ignorance. Again, the ignorance is going to be there by virtue of attachment and hatred being there. But essentially, because attachment and hatred are there, this means that there are far more non-virtuous actions than virtuous actions. Because so much of what we do, even our Dharma practice, is going to be together with the mind of desire, of craving. So again, I pointed out earlier how we could say in Rinpoche's comment here, every action is motivated by attachment, hatred, or ignorance. This means that there are far more non-virtuous actions than virtuous. I think what he's alluding to there, and I maybe shouldn't be speaking for him, but when I talked earlier about how that fundamental ignorance is really much more neutral, it's not non-virtuous by nature, or else we couldn't even create virtue by way of having compassion, a generous mind, patient mind, what have you. Because most of us are still having that ignorance. It's at a deeper level, that is grasping to this I to exist inherently, grasping at everything to exist inherently. That is a more neutral form of an affliction because it can be there with both our virtuous and non-virtuous states of mind. But I would imagine that what Rinpoche is speaking to here is that we have grosser levels of ignorance. Remember when most of you have gone through the Lam Rim, and you know that when we talk about what makes an action complete in regard to the non-virtuous actions, we often talk about in the state of mind that you need to have. One of the factors is that you have to have an affliction present. And we would talk in there about the three root poisons of attachment, anger, and ignorance. And what's meant there is when you have an ignorance that is not even aware of conventional things. So, for example, if you were to take the life of a being out of ignorance, it would be because you are not thinking about the fact that it's a conscious being. You're negating that it has any feelings on its own. So you happily, smash that ant or that mosquito or whatever out of ignorance, thinking that there's no ramifications for that being at all. You might kill, on the other hand, a mosquito out of anger, right? Where you get really upset that it's buzzing you at night and continuing to do all these things that annoy you. And so out of anger, you kill it. Or you might kill it out of attachment. It lands on your hand and you don't really want to, you're quite attached to your body, and don't want the pain of the welt from the mosquito bite. And so you kill it because you're quite attached to your own body. So you could kill a mosquito out of those. And in that case, ignorance is a much grosser form because it's not being maybe, just totally disregarding, well, animals don't matter, insects don't matter. They don't have feelings. They don't have any, don't need to respect them. That would be a mind that of ignorance there. So I'm guessing that that's what Rinpoche meant there, because again, ignorance at the deepest level isn't non-virtue by nature. So let me go back to the slides and do a few more slides, and then we'll come back and look at the chat box. So he says this means if we have these actions motivated in those ways, attachment, hatred, or ignorance, as I said, go back to your Lam Rim teachings and the liberation in the palm of your hand, for example, or any of the other Lam Rim texts, and review what's meant by these non-virtuous actions in terms of the factor of the state of mind that we have to have and how an affliction is required. And so in those cases, we see grosser forms of ignorance. So we would definitely, if that level of ignorance is present, have it as a non-virtue, because that's a mind that is being negligent of the needs of others and thereby creating non-virtue. In other words, went 2 slides. In other words, any activity, whether farming, business, fighting, helping friends and relatives, or meditating, if done with the thought of the worldly dharmas, clinging to this life and motivated by attachment, anger, or ignorance, becomes only the cause of samsara and the lower realms. We end up creating non-virtue when we have that grosser form of ignorance or attachment, anger, because of our being involved in, the worldly dharmas, being involved in holding on to and grasping at the happiness of this life. We need to be very clear about the distinction between dharma and non-dharma. We know that anger is negative, of course, but we aren't angry all the time. What really wastes our precious life isn't anger, but attachment, being attached to the 8 worldly dharmas. This is what makes our life into non-dharma, which of course means that we don't progress to any of the dharmic results beyond this life. That's this third point, is that not only are we not peaceful in the moment, not only do we have problems that ensue in this life, we have problems beyond this life because we cannot actually practice Dharma if we have a mind of attachment. Without clearly understanding what Dharma is, even though we try to practice it our whole life, nothing becomes Dharma because we still have the wrong motivation. We may have a lot of knowledge of what Dharma is, and that may even be the case for many of us, but are we practicing Dharma? Do we have the right motivation? So then he gives the definition of each of these. The definition of non-Dharma is simply anything that is done for the happiness of this life alone. It is whatever we do motivated by attachment to the eight worldly dharmas. That is non-Dharma. Here, capital D Dharma, meaning, it's against, it is blocking our practice of Dharma. Anything done for the happiness of this life alone with that motivation. Again, motivated by attachment. The definition of Dharma is exactly the opposite. It is anything that is done for happiness beyond this life, whatever is unstained by attachment to the eight worldly dharmas. So here too, I think we have to do an internal investigation and see to what degree, even with what level of clarification we have in our own minds about what Dharma is, what non-Dharma is, are we engaging in Dharma? Are we really Dharma practitioners? Are we really Dharma students? Or are we doing things still with some subtle attachment to this life and the happiness of this life? And again, it does, I don't think Rinpoche would spend all the time teaching on this if he didn't think it was a problem. I think it is a pretty big problem from my own experience, again, that we all have to be continually attentive to. And that means we have to check our motivation regularly. This next section I'm going to move into after we finish this part, I may not get to it till next week, is motivation, how motivation really plays a key role. And of course, we can have different motivations, but we have to understand that anything that's motivated purely by attachment to this life isn't even Dharma. Even though, again, recall that story that, of Lama Atisha, when the student was doing all these various things and saying, oh, I'll do this and I'll do that. And he kept saying, well, but as long as it's, a virtuous action. And he couldn't figure out what it was talking about. And Lama Atisha finally says, you have to give up on this life. You have to give up the happiness of this life and your obsession with the happiness of this life, which of course is what this mind of craving and desire is all about. If we give up on this life, we actually can achieve amazing things, unbelievable happiness and well-being for ourselves and others. But we have to be willing to do that. So getting back to the question that I mentioned that was raised a couple of sessions ago, virtue and non-virtue, what's the difference between these then? How do we understand them? How do we know them in terms of our behavior? They are defined on this basis. Every action done renouncing attachment to this life is virtue. Every action done with attachment to this life is non-virtue. I mean, it's a very simple statement. I mean, when we discuss virtue and non-virtue in the teachings on karma, we often talk about how they are defined on the basis of the result they bring about. That a virtuous action brings about happiness, feelings of happiness, experiences of happiness, and the non-virtue brings about feelings of suffering and so on. But nonetheless, this is getting down to some pretty interesting ways of looking at it. That if we have attachment to this life, what's going to be non-virtue? Rinpoche said that a few slides ago, right? That if we have that attachment clinging to this life, it's going to induce the three poisons. It's going to induce non-virtuous states of mind and non-virtuous actions on the basis of that. So that is an interesting way of phrasing it, that it actually has to do with whether we have attachment to this life or not. If we've renounced attachment to this life and at least are not doing things with some attachment to the happiness of this life, well, then we're going to have the practice of virtue. So Rinpoche says, if we renounce the attachment that clings to the pleasures of this life, our attitude becomes pure and everything we do becomes Dharma. Nothing we do is done for just this life. So this is where we go back to the text for a little bit. Actually, yeah, let me go ahead and do this because I don't think there are that many slides left on this. On cutting off desire, that's how I labeled this, at least because it's in that section. Those with much devotion who seek to go beyond samsara are allowed to enter the mandala. This is again from that text that Rinpoche found. One should not desire the results of this life. One who desires this life won't achieve the meaning that goes beyond samsara. So this first initial phrase, he says, comes from tantric teachings, but nonetheless, the idea here is that if we continue to be involved in the pleasures of this life in the way that we've been talking about, having that strong craving, desire for them to continue, for their opposites to not be experienced, well, then we're never going to go beyond samsara. We're never going to achieve a meaning that is beyond samsara. We're never going to accomplish these deeper results. Rinpoche says you can understand it in this way. If your aim is to achieve happiness only in this life, if that is your only expectation, everything you do, work, reciting prayers, taking initiations, eating, sleeping, meditating, whatever, does not become holy Dharma. All those actions are non-virtuous because you're driven by attachment to this life. Your hope is to get happiness, but the only thing you actually get from these actions is suffering. Even though you do your work with the aim of achieving happiness in this life, your actions actually become obstacles to this happiness and you fail to find it. So this is similar to what was said back on the first point. But the point here too is that that carries over then and produces even greater suffering in the future. Whereas seeking to go beyond samsara will increase the happiness of this life samsara. This is what the trick is that if you actually have the mind that is letting go of your attachment to happiness of this life, you will have the happiness of this life because you will have a mind seeking to go beyond samsara to achieve liberation, enlightenment. Yeah. This means that anyone who seeks only enlightenment, which is beyond samsara, and practices Dharma in order to achieve it, even though not seeking the happiness of this life, will find it naturally. It will fall into their lap. They will experience happiness without a doubt when they let go of that attachment and generate the mind that seeks liberation and enlightenment. All our problems arise because we have taken the samsaric rebirth, these aggregates caused by delusion and karma, and contaminated by the seed of the delusions. Because we have taken rebirth, we experience pervasive compounded suffering, which is the third type of suffering I spoke to earlier in a previous class. And because of that, suffering of change, which are the pleasant experiences that don't have the ability to last and do change into pain if we continue to experience them, and the suffering of suffering, which is the most obvious way that we experience discontentment in our lives through painful experiences. But this is what has been happening through the force of samsara. All we've experienced is suffering. But we can have the opposite if we actually let go of our attachment to this life. So not only do we experience these sufferings in this life, but this present samsara becomes the basis of all the future life samsaras and all the future life sufferings. Taking another samsara creates the cause of so many other future life samsaras. This process goes on, and it's been going on since beginningless time. The conclusion is that all Dharma practitioners should renounce desire for the comfort of this life. Unless you renounce this life, there is no way you can even be called a Dharma practitioner. Everything done with desire, seeking the comfort of this life, is not Dharma. As long as there's desire, there is no practice of Dharma. Then one little quote he shares from Kadampa Geshe to conclude this. Lama Gyampa says, renouncing this life is the very start of Dharma. You don't do a single Dharma practice but feel proud of being a Dharma practitioner. How foolish. Check whether your mental continuum contains the very first step of Dharma, renouncing this life. Okay. So again, I was going to go on, if I had time, to importance of motivation. We'll talk about that next week. Let me see what the next Rowena is. What is the connection between desire and our sense of self? Desire is like the water in which we float our boats, maybe in a sense. But definitely, all of our desire, when we talk about it again, not and just like if we say the desire for enlightenment, that's of course a different use of that word. Anything we call desire, that is attachment, clinging, craving, grasping, everything in that vein that is a delusion, is together with the sense of self that we are clinging to that is false. Yeah. We have this root of ignorance that is our enhancing the I that exists in a very nominal way, only nominal way, merely imputed, merely designated. That's the only way that you've ever existed. That sense of an I that we have in relation to this collection of stuff, we hold it to be more real than that. We hold it to have some intrinsic existence. On the basis of that concretizing of that sense of I, we then get into these patterns. As I said, we can also, from that sense of concretizing the I, get into healthy patterns. That's where we create virtue within this life, is when we do have, you might still have that ignorance present, but you engage in acts of generosity, kindness that are very selfless, that are maybe thinking about the happiness of future rebirths or whatever, that are definitely virtuous, but they still haven't gotten rid of the sense of self. But the The faulty states of mind, like craving and clinging and desire and anger and jealousy and all of those, they depend upon this root of ignorance. They cannot arise if that isn't present. That's because they need that sense of reified self to set up the whole scenario for them to come into existence. So when we have the pleasant experiences and we have that strong sense of a self, that's going to be the basis upon which the craving for those comes about, because we want to satisfy that sense of a self. We believe in it so much, and we are the, talk about being the slave to it. We are the slave to desire, but we are also the slave to this ignorance. That ignorance is keeping you in patterns where you simply keep trying to satisfy and take care of and protect and guard this I that doesn't exist at all. The I does exist, but the way it exists would never, for a moment, if we really understood it, give rise to any of those delusions. In the space of the wisdom realizing emptiness, no delusions can arise because you don't have the basis for that skewed relationship with all of these things in our lives. Once we see things through the lens of me, myself, and I, and then of course we also, this is a topic I'm hoping to get to that Rinpoche discusses in the book about replacing our tendency to cherish ourselves with the cherishing others. But once we have that strong cherishing of the self, wanting to take care of the self, wanting to do that even at the cost of others' pain and misery, well then we only create unhealthy patterns. But if we do that within the understanding of emptiness, we have these experiences of something pleasant, then we never get into that kind of mess. The mess all comes about because of the strong clinging to a sense of self. So whether you call it the water that the boat is floating in or whatever, maybe the sense of self is almost the water at times, and the boat is just the way that it manifests in a variety of ways. But every single affliction that we have arises from some level of ignorance. And that would be, again, this strong sense of clinging to a real I, a real person that we can prove doesn't exist. That's what the teachings on emptiness are there for. It's to show us that we believed in something that is fictitious. It's not even real. And we've been defending that sense of a real self as if it were real and getting into trouble by generating attachment to things. I think this is a very hard point to get. I'm not trying to simplify it in what I'm saying by any means, because I think you have to begin to dismantle that sense of self. That's the deeper work, right? That's what we have to do once we've kind of begun on our path and gone through some of the initial teachings that help us to move away from our attachment to this life, our attachment to future lives, our attachment to samsara, and we have to begin to see that the real root problem is this sense of self that we are operating from almost all the time. Lama Tsongkhapa says we do have some moments when it's not so operative, but mostly this is where we are coming from in terms of how we behave in the world, is really believing in this strong sense of an I. And then we do everything we can to get what that I wants and to avoid what that I doesn't want. And this is how we create patterns of craving and desire, as well as anger and aversion, and everything else that comes from them, and all the negative karma we create on the basis of that, and all the suffering we experience on the basis of that karma. And we just keep doing this lifetime after lifetime. That's the real root problem that we have to get to eventually. I don't know if that helped, Rowena, but thank you for asking that question. Yeah. Any other final questions before we conclude today? Were there any more up above? I'm not seeing them on my slide now. Yeah, desire is like the water in which we float our boats. Yeah, I mean, I think it works that way as an analogy. I think, at the same time, though, again, remember that, desire also is contingent upon ignorance. And so it's sort of supported by it. So you could probably put them in a reverse position, you know. But this is the thing to understand, is that if we have to begin working with things at whatever level we're at. Right now in this course, the main emphasis has been on cutting off this grosser form of desire that is keeping us involved in this life, keeping us from looking beyond this life. But then when we start doing the deeper work, as I mentioned earlier in response to Leah's question, then we start working with these temporal antidotes and trying to do what we can to reverse states of mind by thinking differently, and even supplant them with more virtuous states of mind. But that's only going to get you so far. You have to do the root work at some point. You have to uproot the whole process by realizing the wisdom that cuts through that false sense of a self, that makes it non-existent. And then none of these delusions have a basis upon which they will arise. Whether it's they're the boat and ignorance is the water, or whatever the relationship is, without ignorance, these absolutely will not come into play. But we can't do that work immediately. I mean, that's we'd all like to do that, right? And everyone would love to be free of all their delusions tomorrow. Just go into meditative equipoise on emptiness tonight and wake up in the morning and be free of all of them. But it's just simply not going to happen. We have to kind of trim the tree a bit before we can uproot the whole thing. So, all right, that's probably enough for today. Let's go ahead and do our prayers then to dedicate. Mary, I'll get those on the screen, and we'll recite those together. So let's bring to mind, before we recite this wonderful prayer of Master Shantideva, all those beings that we're holding in our hearts right now. And we can hold all beings in our hearts, but it's good to work with specific ones that are involved in your life, whose situation moves you, whether they're experiencing obstacles or illness, whether they are dying or have died recently. Think about them and dedicate the positive energy for them as we recite this prayer. But then also do try to extend this out to all beings, as we do when we recite these words. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. Then we generate this bodhicitta motivation with this last dedication verse. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And let's do the prayers for our precious teachers as we recite these. Think that we're creating the causes also for all other spiritual guides to have good health and long lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And for Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally for Tenzin Osalhita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Okay, thank you all so much. I'll see you all when we regather shortly at 12:30 for Mary. Everyone, please stay safe, healthy. I'll see you all again very soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.